This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 371, WebOps-Enabled Accessibility. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about WebOps-Enabled Accessibility with Taryn Armendariz and Blake Bertuccelli. Taryn has been the guest host for the past 4 weeks, and today she is with us as a guest as well. She is the developer advocate at Pantheon and lead of the Drupal Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. She is also a certified professional accessibility core competencies through the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. Thank you for joining us for the last 4 weeks.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Definitely. Blake is the founder of Equalify, a new open source accessibility platform that's working to provide more affordable accessibility testing. And I hear that congratulations are in order as you just got married a couple of days ago. Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, I went from bad camp to my marriage, so it was a fun-filled week.
Sounds exciting. Well, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder of Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are, usually here's where I say as usual, but it's not as usual. It's a nice blast from the past. Stephen Cross is a guest host sitting in for John today. If you listen to the first 300 episodes of Talking Drupal, you definitely know him. And if you're new to Talking Drupal, well, go back and listen to all the old episodes. But he was a former co-host and now works behind the scenes. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, super happy to be here.
We do have a quick update this week. New England Drupal Camp is November 18th through 19th in Providence, Rhode Island. The 18th is training, I believe, and the 19th is the session day. So definitely, if you're in the New England area or able to travel, definitely check us out. Looking forward to, there's a bunch of really good sessions coming up, and definitely looking forward to seeing everybody again.
So this is the module of the week. We have something new here at Talking Drupal. We have I think we're calling it a correspondent, a module of the week correspondent. So a frequent guest and contributor to the show, Martin Anderson Klutz, is here to join us this week and every week for the near future. And he's going to talk about the module of the week. Martin is a Acquia triple certified Drupal expert and the maintainer of a number of Drupal modules, in addition to being a senior solutions engineer at Acquia pre-sales team. So Martin, welcome. And what is our module of the week?
Thanks, Stephen. Actually, before I jump in there, I want to mention that if anyone has a module that they want to nominate for module of the week, please tag me on ManClue in Drupal Slack and put that into the Talking Drupal channel. So the module that we're going to talk about this week is called Entity Comparison. Essentially what it does is it generates a configurable comparison table for 2 or more Drupal entities. Anybody who's been to a number of e-commerce websites or even just product catalog sites will have seen this kind of functionality where you on individual products can click to add them to a comparison and then click to actually view that comparison. Of note, it's actually not dependent on Commerce, but it's something that you should be able to use with Commerce if you need to. In terms of its history, the module was originally released in 2017, but the current 4.0 release was created in August of 2022, and it's already ready for Drupal 10, in addition to having security coverage. It's not super widely used currently. It's used by 292 websites. But the issue queue for the module is pretty clean. There's 3 open issues and 2 of them have patches that need review. And talking, I think, a little more generally about how the module works, it actually is pretty simple to set up. I tried it out for the first time 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it took me probably less than a half day to really get it set up and working, including customizing which attributes would be used for the comparison. It basically generates comparison configuration entities. And then within those, you'll specify which entity type and which bundle will be used. And then that actually automatically will create a view mode for that selected bundle. And that allows you through the Drupal UI to specify which attributes are going to be displayed in which order and using which formatters. And then it also provides a couple of other nice features, custom blocks that you can use. So either to like place on your product page to add to that comparison feature, as well as another block to actually provide the link out to the actual comparison itself. The other thing that it does is it actually provides a field of its own. So if you have sort of your standard product page and you don't want to use that block, you can actually display that as a standard field through the field UI as well. So maybe for the rest of the hosts here, has anybody used either any entity comparison or a different solution for generating this kind of product comparison functionality?
Well, it sounds like the key feature of this is it allows the end user to compare two entities, right? It's not that you're just building a table to compare a couple of things. It's so that the end user can be like, I'm interested in this one and this other one. What's the key features, right?
Yeah, very, very good point. It's yeah, as you say, it's not like on some Amazon product pages where you'll see like a pre-generated comparison of all of the products in their line. It's, as you say, more for the visitor to be able to pick which products they want to compare.
I've not used this. I've built that feature a few times manually. So I'm sure I have a couple clients that I'm definitely going to take a look at this for and see if it's worth moving all the custom code into the system, because it's fairly hefty to to manage that yourself.
Yeah, I can definitely think of a couple of products or projects that I worked on where we talked a customer out of this kind of functionality because we thought it would be too expensive for them to implement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Martin, what was the use case that you looked at this module? Did you have something in mind?
So I was talking to a customer who is thinking about going to Drupal for their CMS, and one of the capabilities that they really wanted to see was this ability to do a product comparison. And so did a little searching around and found this, and I thought it was great that it's obviously you could use it on a commerce site, but the fact that you can use it in a variety of different use cases, I thought was pretty interesting. So as an example, you could do something like, let's say, a job search site where the person who posted a listing could actually do a quick comparison of different people who had applied to that job. Or conversely, a job seeker could do like a comparison of different jobs that they're interested in.
Interesting.
Yeah, this makes me think of the healthcare.gov page, right? When you're going in, for context, if people haven't used it, when you sign up for healthcare.gov, you can go in and there are tons and tons of plans, depending on context, right? That you can view, but sometimes you want to see like side by side deductible for this one versus deductible for that one, and having to build that kind of thing out for so many different plans could be very cumbersome. But allowing the end user to control that, only you as an individual know what your healthcare needs are. So I can see a lot of utility there.
Can you expose some of the options to the end user too? So rather than just being like, I want to compare these two things, can you give them the ability to be like, I want to compare the price or the description? Or is it just you, as you just say, if you're comparing these two entities, these are the fields you get, and that's that?
So the comparisons are sort of predefined, but theoretically you could have more than one comparison for the same bundle. So you could say like compare based on price or compare based on features as like two different options, and expose those.
Martin, have you determined how flexible the user interface is to make modifications to that kind of UI for the end user?
So full confession, I haven't used this a ton myself, but based on that kind of initial setup and trying it out, it seems, again, because it leverages sort of the field UI that's very flexible within Drupal, you can even create new formatters, completely custom if you need to. It really gives you a lot of flexibility as a site builder.
Now I want to build something just to experiment with it.
You're right.
Sounds neat.
Well, thank you for joining us, Martin, for this new segment. It definitely is an interesting module. Like Terrence said, I have a couple of use cases in mind for it. So thank you for joining us and appreciate your input.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next week.
See you.
Definitely. Okay, moving on to our primary topic of the week. The title of the show this week is WebOps Enabled Accessibility. So let's start with, what is WebOps? I mean, I've heard of DevOps. What is WebOps?
WebOps is a set of practices and workflows that facilitate collaboration. They encourage automation of operations, and they improve the productivity of web teams. For DevOps, we're all familiar with that, where it's bringing developers and the system operators together. With WebOps, you're focusing on how you're bringing together your developers, marketing systems engineers, marketing operations, designers, content creators, and other folks in marketing into a cross-functional team. I think that one thing that's really important is that a lot of the folks that I listed as like the actors and WebOps teams that are different, they're some of the key owners and have direct impact on your accessibility items because they're the ones that are forming the shape of your content, your designers, people that are sending out your marketing ops, like your emails that people get, and then especially your content creators. So you have to be like, no, you can't use like size 11 font for this email. Please put all text on things. It's required. We might get sued. So.
And one of the things that we found is that a lot of the accessibility, the people who are managing accessibility are not developers. They are end users, and they're not even familiar with anything beyond like a WYSIWYG editor. So when they're asked to manage big accessibility issues that are being reported to them, they don't have an easy user interface to both manage the tests that are going into these accessibility requirements and also the remediation of actually fixing the errors. So, that's one of the reasons that we're using the word WebOps a lot, because we want to work with people who aren't just developers. There's a lot of great development tools for accessibility testing and remediation, but there's not a lot of easy to use and most importantly affordable user interface components that allow the end user, the editors, the marketing managers, the accessibility managers to really get in and manage their own accessibility.
We now know what WebOps is. It's pulling in the full team from content to developers rather than focusing just on the developer side, right? But what is the WebOps enabled accessibility? So it sounds like it's a little bit about allowing the non-technical folks insight into it. Is it beyond that, or is it really just what you were saying, Blake?
Yeah, I mean, what we look at a lot is also the tools that people are using. So when people are using web services, not as a CI component or a CD component, but as a literal interface that they log into, they use, and they manipulate, that's when it starts to go into the WebOps world a little bit more. And so it's not just like we're talking about the stakeholders, it's also the tools that the stakeholders are using. And great tools like Pantheon's system, how does that, we're asking the question of like, how do web services like that integrate with other web services to provide better accessibility? And we think that it's not just about doing one thing. It's not just about updating one piece of the code base. You really have to think about the entire network of infrastructure that you're using to run a website when you're talking about accessibility. We see a lot of the accessibility errors, from a user-created error to a server-created error. And so in order to maintain and manage those errors in a way that is holistic and kind of speaks to the reality of where errors are coming from, you have to think about all the different users that are using and maintaining a website and all the different types of technology that's going into to create these websites.
So you said that you should be thinking about all of these different users. Why should you be thinking about them?
The big reason is because the people with the budgets are giving money to people who are non-technical to manage these accessibility problems. And just kind of a quick history on why accessibility is important right now. It starts with giving people with disabilities access to information that we all know and love. That is the real reason why we're doing this work and why it's so important. The second tier is the government mandated piece. So the US, for instance, and governments all over the world are doing the same thing. If you receive money from the US through like a grant, so if you're an education institution and you've received money through the US Department of Education, you have to maintain website accessibility standards, sort of 508 standards, and you are legally mandated to maintain those standards. It's just like having a wheelchair ramp into your place of business. You have to have these basic accessibility requirements met, or you're going to get sued. So what we're seeing right now are a lot of higher ed institutions specifically, and that's who we're working with mostly with Equalify, but a lot of higher ed institutions are getting these scary letters from the US Department of Justice, and they're freaking out and hiring law firms or hiring big, really expensive companies who say that they're going to do a bunch of remediation. And then they also start departments in their own university. And the people starting departments, we see this again and again, are folks that are non-technical. They might have subject expertise, but they're non-technical. And we think that these non-technical users should be enabled to remediate accessibility, just like the great developers that know how to run the CI and CD tools that are out there today.
And so
And from
traditionally, what kind of tools are used for that? Used for automating that on the DevOps side?
In the DevOps side, there's some great automated accessibility scanning tools. So Axe by Deque is a really cool one. You know, there's Google Lighthouse that a lot of people use in the browsers. There's Wave, which we personally have integrated with and love to use. They have an API that you can basically run any kind of URL against. And then there's other tools like Little Forest is another good one. So those are the automated accessibility scanners. These are going to find about from 13 to 40% of your accessibility issues. So they're not going to find all the accessibility issues, but if you use like Google Lighthouse and it scans through your website, it'll find around, Google Lighthouse will probably find around 30% of the compliance issues you have. The second tier is when you start to need more specialized experience, and that's literally manual testing. And so the WCAG 2.1 guidelines have manual tests and different guidelines to maintain accessibility. Now that type of manual testing, which is required, is going to need some level of subject expertise. So you're going to have to be aware and know about these manual tests. You're reading it's just like any kind of HTML guidelines. You have to read through the guidelines, try to memorize them, and do the best you can. I remember I was working with somebody from the Department of Justice on how they test it. And literally it was one person who did not use any of the automated tests, and she just really knew all the guidelines. And so she went through and clicked tab and saw where the mouse went. She had a screen reader that read out to her, and she went through the guidelines and tested a site very manually. And I do hope that with some of this WebOps conversation and some deeper integrations with Drupal, we can automate or at least make that experience of manual testing and remediation a little bit easier.
To be honest, I mean,
that
that manual person is better than what we see in a lot of places, right? At least it's someone dedicated to figuring that out.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add in there is that there are certification tests for it. Like I mentioned in my intro, I'm a CPAC certified practitioner, right? But the test is very intensive. It covers a lot. I had to take the CPAC certification twice just because there's so much content that's covered in it, both for the US and for all the other sites that you have to, or the other laws that you have to comply with overseas as well, right? Because our sites are not just seen in the United States. Blake mentioned earlier about the manual code review. With us learning all of these criteria that exist, the different principles, even when you're doing your manual code review for your WCAG 2.0 standards, 80% of those standards have to be tested manually. And now with the 2.1 success criteria, 100% of those have to be tested manually.
Oh, really?
So yeah, like considering how few people are actually certified for being able to do this manual testing, and how much manual testing there is even once you're certified and have so much of this memorized, as much stuff as you can automate, you're going to save money for your company, your entities, or your clients, and you're going to save time for your teams. And that means that they can focus on these bigger, stickier, hairier issues.
Are you suggesting that the automated process that we're talking about today replaces a certified person?
No, 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 no. It augments that experience. So
Okay.
that way, if I come into a project, right, if I'm having to do all these manual reports, going through, testing everything one by one, that's going to take time away from me being able to communicate why this change is important to a client, right? It's going to take away the time for, I am both a front end developer and somebody that's a certified accessibility practitioner. I can be spending time remediating things if I'm not spending all of my time doing these things that could be automated. We'll probably talk about it more in a bit, but there's aspects of like user experience review and user testing, and those aspects will also get more time the more of this rote testable stuff that we can automate.
Well, let's talk about that now. So what kinds of tests are we talking about?
The big stuff that, so Equalify has been using multiple different scanners to scan thousands and thousands of pages. And there are about 111 points that we have found that are really successful in the automated testing. A good chunk of those, I would say around, I don't know, 15 of those 111 are around ARIA and around alt text. So that's a big one of just like labeling things for screen readers and providing different alt text for different media items. That's a huge thing that people just forget about. It's not there. Other issues that we're seeing a lot of are around contrast, color contrast. So that's a really big piece of just not having the right amount of contrast for people with low vision. And then we see kind of the more complicated stuff around the way that we're titling things, the way that we're using headings, the way that we use descriptive text, the kind of descriptive text that is being used. And a lot of that kind of more nuanced approach isn't really well tested by these automated tests, but at least you can find the big pieces around alt text, ARIA text. The semantics of HTML is another thing, making sure you have your H1 followed by your H2 followed by your H3. Because if you look at people who are using screen readers, they're jumping around a page a lot, and they use these tags to navigate. And if it's amazing, if anybody ever has a chance to watch somebody who really knows how to use a screen reader, it's one of the most amazing experiences because they're reading it. They're being read the information like a book, but at super fast speeds, sometimes 2-3 times speeds. And they're navigating through a web page like we do visually, where they're jumping around and saying, what do I find interesting? And if they don't have those proper headings, proper links, if there's a lot of like heavy JavaScript and modals, they're not able to find the information. And just kind of one quick example, or one quick story that somebody from the Department of Justice told me was that they were testing a lot of the higher ed websites with people with disabilities and screen readers, and that's how they started testing with it. But the websites were so bad, they had so many modals, so many kind of weird pieces that the people who were using screen readers didn't even know they were missing out on content. And it was a huge issue because they couldn't report on errors because the websites were so bad that the screen readers wouldn't even read it. So there was a lot of JavaScript that was put in an inaccessible way. Adding modals was the biggest issue. So again, the semantics around HTML are really key, and just describing images in a very descriptive way and adding color contrast.
Yeah, a lot of that is stuff that you can catch with the manual testing semantics, right? But once you get into the user experience review part of testing, Blake mentioned, it's like your visual structure, your logical page layout, menu functionality, button size. Those are things that need a human being to go in and test, whether that's somebody with like different vision issues, mobility issues. I have a kind of fun anecdote on that one. when I was working for local government, we built out a retirement portal and we were having folks fill out the form. Now, one thing I did not think about, I don't keep my nails done, but I have like kind of smaller-ish, medium-sized hands filling out this form. And we went to a job site with some gentlemen that had like much bigger hands than I had, and some of them had even the gloves where you could do things tactily. When they were trying to press the buttons, they couldn't because the buttons were too small for them. And I never would have known that had we not done like some UX review type stuff with them. So yeah, that's why we got to automate the other stuff.
One of the things I'm curious about too, when you're talking about this, is kind of the reporting. Like, it's clear we're a long way away from accessibility testing being fully automated, right? But we want to automate as much as we can because, like you said, it frees you up to do some other stuff. But one of the things I've run into fairly often is, especially around color contrast, because you brought that up, like false positives. The automated system basically says, hey, we can tell there's a color here, but there's a background issue, so we can't tell what the color contrast is. It needs to be manually reviewed. I find, whether you're technical or not, but sometimes particularly for non-technical folks, like that very quickly just becomes white noise. If every single page they see there's 30 issues for color contrast. Now, in the example I'm thinking of, there is no color contrast issue. Everything has been fully vetted. But how do we make sure that it doesn't become white noise? How do we make sure that or how are we informing these users, like when you see this issue, this is specifically what you should be looking at to confirm? Or is there a way to say like, well, ignore this unless it changes in the future because we vetted this. We don't want to be flagged on this issue again unless something changes, because then something might be broken, right?
That's the key right there. That's the key. Is I've addressed it. Don't tell me unless something else has changed. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a qualify, that's one of that use case, that issue is exactly something that we built our platform for. So we do have a big ignore button that then ignores the issues from coming up. And if it's a similar, we have about 5 different criteria that we look for. And if an issue is reported within those same criteria, it will be ignored. You can always unignore. And then furthermore, if you take care of it, it will be marked qualified for all of history. So you will never have to remark it. That said, we do see the false positives a lot. And another thing that we're trying to solve with our platform is create a environment that you can easily integrate many different types of scans or many different scanning solutions. So what we've done is kind of create our own kind of version of modules where you can pretty easily integrate any scan, whether it's Axe, Wave, any of these, into the Equalify system. And we've been running a few different scans, and what we're doing with these scans is we're running them against each other. So for instance, we can run Little Forest against Wave, and when we did that, we saw that Little Forest was producing a lot of false positives that just Wave wasn't picking up on. So we were able to flag them as probable false positives. So again, that's just an extra level of automation that we can reduce. And it's something that we saw as a unique kind of piece and why we wanted to develop it, because when a company is focused so much on their own scan and they're not constantly comparing many different scans, they can get into a real big false positive loop where they just don't recognize it. So we're able to not only like ignore the false positives, but to flag them. And we're working closely with some of the scanning developers to say, hey, this is coming up again and again and again. You probably want to fix this. And so hopefully we can limit it. Eventually, in our next version, we're going to be putting out better statistics on the false positives we find, so that anybody can access it. So we can like publicly shame the automated scanning services to like make some corrections and give them that information.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that let's publicly shame them, because they're doing God's work, but as I say, but I will say one thing that I noticed heavily, in particular on this project that I've talked about on the show before, we use native web components extensively. And these automated scanners do not handle color contrast in native web components. Now, one of the great things about native web components is it's semantic HTML. It's in the spec. A lot of the issues that you would get from JavaScript oriented stuff doesn't exist with native web components, because it just dives into the shadow DOM and it just kind of works. But color contrast is not one of those. Almost every native web component that has a background color anywhere just automatically gets flagged.
Well, why would a web component be different than any other HTML in terms of color contrast? I don't follow that in terms of the testing side.
My understanding is it just can't determine what's the way it's layered. So it just doesn't know if the colors on the background or on top. Like it just can't figure out the layering for some reason.
It probably doesn't understand the relation between it and the other entities around it.
Yeah.
A lot of these scanners, not all of them, are just doing a simple curl of the HTML on the page. You're not really going any more beyond that.
That's why I was wondering how a web component would be different. At the end of the day, the HTML that gets rendered on the page is what's tested.
It could have been about when at the time in which they did the curl. We tested a few scans that just that scanned a page before the page was fully rendered, and all the render blocking scripts they just totally ignored. So it's really about what the scan can do, and when it's scanning the page.
Yeah. So one of the reasons that I really, one of the things that Drupal really pushed for, especially I think in the 8 release and moving forward, is accessibility. It's not 100% accessible out of the box, but it does a lot better than a lot of other CMSs out there. But I guess the next question is, like, if something like Drupal, if you're using a tool like Drupal and it has accessibility out of the box, why do we need accessibility testing then?
Because of all the things we developers do in the aftermath.
Yeah.
A lot of these services come in with a base, right? The web itself comes with a base of accessibility, but there's all the neat tricks and tips and cool functionality that we want to build in that'll create a dynamic experience for our users, right? And each thing that we do to modify that, it changes the experience for the user. It changes how that page is built out. That's why, to me, it's important for us to use, Drupal, WordPresses, and have that accessibility as our base so that we have a good place to build off from, but then also to be cognizant of the fact that when we create a change, it has an impact. Just like it would with any kind of other code or JavaScript thing that we do, it will have an impact on your accessibility as well.
And so much of the accessibility errors are around user-added content. I would say, I was talking to someone from Colorado University System, and they said, everything that we commit is accessible. It's all good, it's the users at the end of the day. And even, I've seen some pretty locked down environments where there's no WYSIWYG, there's nothing. It's amazing what users can do to make things inaccessible. A lot of times it's around images. That's what I see a lot of. But then PDFs are terrible. And that's one of the biggest headaches that come up. So as soon as a PDF is even linked to, the content is accessible and inaccessible.
Or YouTube,
or YouTube,
My website is a static website that doesn't have anything on it except for, one of the only functionality on the site really is just a link to our to the show, right? The only page that throws any accessibility errors is YouTube. There's a lot of iframe stuff in there, and I just haven't quite resolved them all yet. But yeah, when you're adding content, it's going to be a problem. And one of the things I think people forget is you can make things like alt tags required, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you can't force the user to not just put in a period or put in, the name of the file, which isn't helpful, right? And it also depends on what you're targeting. The lowest level is just this is a brief description that says the image is a picture of a person, right? But if you're going to full AAA, you're going to say this is an image of a person looking at object X and they're wearing a yellow jacket, right? It's more of an actual description of the full scene. And that can't be automated on the testing side or on the entry side whatsoever.
That's where that manual person looking at the content helps out.
Yep.
And we've seen a lot. One of the most successful use cases I've seen around training users was at Harvard, where before any user could put in any content whatsoever on a site, they had to go through a pretty extensive training. And it was a training that was built on empathy. So they worked with and saw people with disabilities and like why you would need to do this and why you should describe a raincoat as yellow and go into, you know, the bigger descriptions. And I'm, you know, a big believer that if you can build those kind of empathetic tools and show like really like why you need to talk about the content on the page in a more descriptive way, you will have better accessibility standards and your users will follow through on it. And most of the sites that don't have the great compliance are not training their users and do not provide this type of, you know, very important training.
It also takes a lot of maintenance sometimes. So for example, many times when you build a component, like a front-end component, you're saying like, this is an H3, right? And if that gets put after an H2, great. But if it gets put after an H4, well, that's going to be a problem. But giving end users the ability to choose H4 level midstream in content is, I mean, that's also a lot of mental load for them. Like they have to think like, where in the content is this? What's the one that's before? It needs to be this. Or if somebody has the right order and then they pull a piece of content out in the middle, well, now all of a sudden you're jumping one. So then you have to go and edit everything below it to get it to the correct level. So it takes a lot of maintenance to make sure, and a lot of thought to make sure that you're making it easy for content entry people to make that change. And I'm not sure that there's a perfect solution around that because, I mean, it's a lot of effort for a developer to give complete control there, and it's a lot of effort for the content editor too. Or in Drupal, like this is a Drupal specific example, pagers by default are H4s, right? You don't always want an H4 at the bottom of the page. Sometimes it needs to be an H5, sometimes it needs to, but like that's something that you're not going to give the end user the ability to change, right? So how do you find what the right thing is? I mean, the right thing is to not have it be a header period, make it like a pager element, but it's definitely something that takes a lot of maintenance on both things, on both sides, both the developer and the content side.
Hey, Blake, you mentioned the training that they did at Harvard. Do you have any recommendations for content editor or admin trainings that we could share with our listeners, put in the show notes?
There's a lot of good trainings. I just saw one come out from the Department of Justice they have a pretty good video series that just came out. And the reason why I think it's a good training, they're good videos, but it's also what they're looking for. So if people are worried about getting sued, they can say, I've done this training and I've seen this training. You know, they're a much more kind of intense trainings that you can do. I think Harvard's is actually just available for anybody to use, which I'll give a link to as well. But the best thing that I've seen, and I mean, this is for me personally, is like talking with and working with somebody with a disability. And then just saying like, you know, how do you browse the internet? Watching them browse the internet. There's a number of great videos of just people using the internet. And that's super inspiring and something again and again, you know, you can have X amount of standards, but until you know that how it's going to impact somebody, and you can really think about that.
I mean, one of the most impactful keynotes that we've had, I think, at NEDCamp was we had a gentleman from the, I think, Institute of the Blind in Massachusetts come. I think his name was Brian.
Right. Yep.
And he was a keynote speaker, and his talk was basically like, here's an accessible website that I can use, and here's a local website. So he chose some local restaurant that's not accessible and just showed us the pain that's involved in browsing a site that nobody's paid attention to accessibility on. And I was thinking of that earlier too, and we'll put a link to that because I think we have it in our feed somewhere. We'll put a link there. Just being able to see how people experience the web, gives you that empathy. It makes you realize like we really need to pay attention to this. And I was thinking of it earlier when you mentioned too the 2x speed. I felt like he was listening to it like 5x speed.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't hear what they were saying. He was already moving to the next thing. Like he knew where he was going and how to get there on the sites that he had experience with, which is same to us. Like if you're on a brand new site, you're going to spend some time kind of looking down the page, finding what you want. But if it's a site you use every day, you just go on and you hit the scroll wheel just right. And it, like, if it's a long page and it ends up right where you want to be, it was the same experience for him, but auditory and at a speed that I couldn't even understand what the text to speech was saying.
I really like this conversation thread around empathy, like being part of the training, because I feel like this relates to a lot of different factors of inclusion, right? We've all felt it at some point because we're human beings, where there's something that's quote unquote extra that we're being asked to do. And it's like, well, why do I need to do X? And putting the empathy of understanding what the other person's experience is when we don't do X, I feel like that makes a lot of us more inclined to understand the importance of it. So it's great.
And it's also, I mean, so much accessibility that I see, the bad accessibility remediation that maybe meets compliance dumbs down web content rather than like makes it able for people with disabilities to use. Because like, again, if you look at someone with a screen reader, like their ability to understand information is amazing. It's just like straight up amazing. And maybe they're understanding it in a different way or using different senses than we are, but we don't have, like, I've seen websites and website managers say, oh, well, let's cut a lot of the content off because like we don't want to bother with dealing with the headings of this content and things like that. And that doesn't, like, that might solve the compliance issue, but it's not doing service to the end users. So it is like, things don't need to be dumbed down to be accessible. They should just be able to be used by different senses. And that's a key component that I see.
I do want to say though that it sometimes cleaning up the content is the solution though too. So like sometimes people put a lot of extraneous information, and so sometimes cleaning up the content and trimming it down is part of the solution, but it shouldn't be the only thing that you do. But it definitely can, and that can help for the people that aren't using screen readers as well. I mean, if you have 300 words on the page when you only need 50, I mean, that's an accessibility issue for everybody, right? Who has time to read 300 words when 50 will do, right? But yeah, you shouldn't be. It doesn't have to be patronizing, right?
Yeah, the example that I'm thinking of was literally a website manager not wanting the images, like cutting really good vital images of graphs and things, because graphs are really hard to articulate with screen readers, and it's still an issue that I've been working with for a long time. And literally cutting out these graphs, these data visualizations, because they don't have the time to figure out better ways to articulate the information, and then maybe and literally dumbing down the content because they do not have the data that should be on the page. And I see it a lot in higher ed institutions, and it just drives me nuts because that's the meat and potatoes of these websites.
Yeah, that's definitely not the solution. Okay, so when you're talking about the web ops workflow, where does this get put in? Because normally automated testing for DevOps, it happens during the CI pipeline before deployment or before deployment to an environment. Where in the web ops workflow does accessibility testing get put into the process?
So the way where I see it is, there's the ideal way, which is every step along the deployment process. Whenever you consider deploying, where it's like even committing, I would say, it's just when you develop a new feature and you want to make sure it works. There are a lot of good CI/CD tools that can work when you're merging your code and getting it ready. But where it goes into the web ops is when you publish content, and before that content is promoted or marketed is the best time that I see folks utilizing it. At Tulane University, where I am right this second, a lot of the checks happen literally before a user can push the publish button.
Okay.
So it'll go through the automated checks before they can push publish button. I've seen a lot of times marketing departments deploying it very successfully, and before they market any piece of content, that's when they're going to go through the checks. But
Okay.
that's not the ideal, because you're only checking a small percentage of the content because it's only the content being marketed. It really should be at every step along the way. There isn't like a single now it's the QA accessibility time, because it changes so often. Ideally, you're also employing kind of regular audits across the entire web estate. So some of the more successful universities I see using it have an annual or quarterly audit of their end content, and that's really successful. But it's a constantly moving target, so it should be constantly tested, and there's really no this is the time, this is the QA time.
Yeah, it's kind of like technical debt in some respect, that it accumulates over time. Like sometimes, like as vigilant as you are, some things will slip through the cracks, or standards will change, or people's understandings will change, and there's a maintenance aspect to it. But I think your comment that it needs to be done regularly is a good one. I mean, I have a client. It's a discussion we've had on the show over the past couple of years, where accessibility a few years ago was a line item, right? And over the last couple of years, it's just become, you make accessible sites if you are a modern web developer, right? It's not a line item anymore. Now your prices reflect the additional work that goes into it, but it's not a line item. It's not something that a client can be like, well, I don't have the budget for that, so I'm not going to do that. No, accessibility is part of the budget. But I'm seeing another shift now with some clients, where even as it shifted to not a line item, it still was you build the site and then you do the accessibility pass before you go live. Like there's a QA phase and there's an accessibility phase, right? I'm seeing clients just moving that up and saying we do the accessibility review in the design phase, we do it in the integration phase, we do it in the development phase, because if you catch those issues earlier, it makes each step easier to maintain that accessibility level. If you wait to the end and you go, you know what, these buttons are all too small, well, now you have to, and then just making them bigger might make the designs look weird. So if you had addressed that during the design phase, then everything would have been fine, and it never would have gotten flagged. It would have been fixed early in the process. So I'm seeing it in a much earlier integration with a lot of clients for the accessibility side, which is encouraging.
I'm definitely seeing it in a more holistic way as well, where one of the first, so my background was in local government, and then eventually I switched over to finance. I got called in to do a remediation because they had seen the talk that I did about accessibility that we had at the local government side. And being a financial institution, especially, they need to make sure that everybody has equal access to lending, right? And they had a visually impaired user that could not navigate, could not update their forms. And not only was it my job to remediate on the site, but also to teach the QA team how to test for accessibility. So I had on a lot of hats, but it was really great to see even the QA team catching things that I had not taught them about yet, because they went through that process. And so not only the project that we were remediating, but all other projects that came through, they started putting those standards so that anything new that came in was going through those tests. So
yeah, so Blake, you mentioned that you would love to see this integrated into all aspects of the process. Like I think you even mentioned commits.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to imagine in my head what accessibility test would run when I did a commit.
Well, with the commits, I was actually more thinking about what your commit message is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because some of the users Qualify is a totally open source AGPL like friendly GitHub repo, and we have users that like do read all the commits and
Mhm.
do want to know what you're doing and how you're doing and how you're testing it. And for instance, here, this is a direct example. Emojis in commits, emojis are not accessible. And
Gotcha.
so little things like that, just making sure that like you're thinking about what I'm talking about is more like thinking about accessibility every step of the way. Um, and it should be part of every developer, designer, and user's thought process throughout everything, and including in the commits. Now, we do so like when I'm committing pieces, if it's accessible commit, I'm thinking about like how I'm branching it, how I'm relating it to different issues and different things like that, so that users with disabilities that I want to test these commits can think about that. So that's an extra level. But I would say like just on a basic level, like just not including emojis and things like that to describe information um, is starting to think about accessibility and commits.
So in some of the projects I work on, we have like Git hooks that trigger processes to run when I do a commit. And I was trying to like imagine what an accessibility one would look like, because I think it's very content heavy, like to do a accessibility test. So that's where my question was, is like how could I do that on a commit level to do accessibility testing? I think that's difficult.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen the automated accessibility testing usually happens before deployment at some
Okay.
point, and
Yeah.
and
Okay.
so I don't think that it's usually like a CI/CD kind of
Gotcha.
test for the automated accessibility. But again, I think what we have been like kind of pushing hard is that accessibility shouldn't just be about the automated tests that we're thinking about. It should literally be about every step along the way, in the way that you think about your end users every step along the way, and who's actually using the code you're writing. You should think about like how those end users, what disabilities they might have, or even if they don't have disabilities, how your end users can understand what you're putting out there.
There is an axe linter that you can run with GitHub Actions, and it'll run it on pull requests and look for accessibility vulnerabilities. So there is that you can use in the process. You can link to
Oh,
it.
that's an interesting framing too,
Yeah.
calling it a vulnerability. Like you're starting to treat it like security. And here it's like it's a usability vulnerability, but it's also a legal vulnerability. I'm
Mhm.
gonna have to think about framing accessibility to some clients like that.
And
I like it.
for our listeners, when you come back to the show notes, I think we probably have the most resources or close to it that we've ever added for any show. It's a
Yeah,
big list.
There's so much to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're talking about these tests again, whether it's happening in CI or happening before, what kind of results are you getting from them? Are they pass fail? Are they a percentage based thing? Are they just output to read? Like, what can you expect as a response from these types of tests?
So one of the major things, so you're testing largely against WCAG 2.1 compliance standards, and you're seeing a lot of pass fails related to the tests that you can automatically test against compliance standards. Then there's additional kind of testing around contrast issues, and depending on what scanner you're using, you might just say you failed, figure out the solution, or you failed, and here's the test that you failed, and here are some possible solutions for it. So for example, like Wave does a really good job of listing out the guidelines that are related to the test, and then hoping that you will piece together the solutions on that by following those guidelines. Some other tests. Yep, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think that's my biggest complaint about accessibility testing is like you get, like I would, whether you use Axe or Wave, like I feel like it's always like, here's the issue. Like Axe will link to the DQ article and the specification, but it's like with something like color contrast, it's fairly straightforward. You take the two colors, you put them into some contrast checker, and it's like, okay, what am I targeting? Does it have to be 4:1, 8:1, 12:1? What does it have to be? Easy, right? Now, the automated test couldn't figure out what it was, fine. But then there's ones like, there's other ones like other false positives that's not as easy. Like, well, I don't think it's an issue, but I don't have, like, it's very difficult sometimes to map the specification to the actual implementation that you have and know for sure whether it's a false positive or it's something that you actually have to fix and address. Or even if you know it's not a false positive, sometimes like, okay, how do I address again? If it's like, oh, it's an H1 and then there's an H2 and then an H1, again, the way to address that is, okay, I need to make that second H1 not an H1, or I need to wrap it in a section or an article, something like that, right? But sometimes the spec is just, okay, where do I begin to address this? I think that's one of the biggest complaints that I get from other developers. It's a complaint that I have myself. How do you go about making that determination? Is the answer just you need to find an expert and ask them, or is there a resource for like bridging that gap?
I was gonna say, I think it's a blend of the two. I think that when I started doing the remediations at the financial institution, a lot of what I learned from were the teachings of the late Rachel Olivero, who was in our Drupal community and who we named Olivero after. I suggested that name at Lullabot because she had helped me so much, even not being there. But being able to consult, so saying to go do the research that you can on a thing, that's the first layer. And then relying on your communities. There are a ton of accessibility communities, both in our own Drupal community, and there's accessibility community on Twitter. I'm sure that there's some in the WordPress arena as well. That's your second line. And once you get to a spot where you're not sure, based on even the knowledge that you have, just like any other like JavaScript or Drupal issue that we'd have, then you would want to see about reaching out to someone, either a professional or like getting a consultation. That's the method that I would suggest for tackling those types of issues. Bleak?
And I think there's a lot of room to get better on this particular front. So a complaint that we've heard over and over again is exactly what you were talking about, which is like, we have to do an extra step before we actually do the remediation. We have to go search for what the guideline means, how it means, and how it works within the semantics. Then we have to search for, like, we might have the theme or template might be where the issue is, but we don't really know exactly where. We have to go search for the issue. So one of the things that we've been trying to do with Equalify, and I literally just posted a issue about this just a few hours ago, so it's hot in my mind, is making that type of remediation more in line with the reporting. And that requires like an extra level of trust from a developer, because you're giving the ability to update, whether it's core code or any kind of database stuff, through a dashboard around the testing. And so the person who's doing the test needs to have the level of access that would allow them to update the code. That's really the big holdup, is like those two access levels are usually different. We have been testing a pretty cool solution with WordPress, because WordPress has a pretty easy history kind of function built in, where we can leverage WordPress's core like post history and just publish the updates to a user post. And so if if the website owner wants to roll back an update, they can do that using the WordPress like core history component, and that's very possible with Drupal too. It was just a low-hanging fruit to push out a plugin that did that.
Interesting.
So we've been talking about some of the accessibility tools you can use to test your website. We've mentioned Wave and Axe. What are the premium services that you would be using? And I say premium in a way to say the most common or the best maybe services you could be using to test your website. Also interested to know what are the free services you could use to integrate into your web ops.
So premium, as far as cost and effectiveness, are two different things in the accessibility universe. I will not come here to throw anybody under the bus, but I'll just say that the price tag that someone has quoted on the accessibility service doesn't mean that they're going to get the features that should correspond with those price tags. There are folks that we've worked with before. Little Forest is a good one. Dubbot is another one. Siteimprove is an accessibility service. Pope Tech, which uses Wave. Wave is another one. There are tons of them. Equalify, of course, is another platform, but Equalify is kind of taking more of an objective approach where we're integrating a lot of them together. There are a lot out there, and I think that the choice really comes to how you want to use your accessibility service. So if you're a developer and you're comfortable with running CI/CD kind of runtime stuff, then maybe Axe is going to be a good solution for you, because you can get in there and really utilize it the way you want to, or Wave's API. Google DevTools, the Google Lighthouse, is a really easy, low-hanging fruit automated service. Again, though, the caution is that someone says their site's accessible because they pass all the tests that Google DevTools say they should do. So I would highly recommend, if anybody's listening to this and wants to immediately get into accessibility testing, to read the WCAG guidelines, watch some of the great videos on testing, and that's really where you should start, not necessarily the automated tools themselves. I was just going to say, one of the best resources to compare and look at accessibility testing and also get a good understanding of it is the UK government published an accessibility tool audit that is really, really good, and it's really, really good, not only because it goes through about 13 different accessibility services and really kind of lists out the features and the comparison, but because all of that comparison is put in the context of the best service can only find 40% of the issues.
Wow.
So it's a great thing to show clients, because it is the UK government. It's on a UK government website. I guess I can give you a link to put in the growing show notes. But it's really good because it does say, here are the options, but the options are only really this good.
So I want to ask one more question related to this. Is that when we're talking about web ops, it implies that the services we're talking about have APIs that you can interface with to get feedback from. So when you mentioned something like Siteimprove, which is a site I'm familiar with for accessibility, do they have the API that you can integrate with in a web ops scenario to get the feedback that you need? Or is it more of a testing tool?
Well, Siteimprove particularly depends how much you're paying.
Okay.
Yeah, there, and I would kind of also push back a little bit on the idea of just web ops for APIs, because there are integrations beyond APIs that allow something to work in the web ops. I think that as long as you can, as long as there is an ability to integrate with other services, as far as just in workflow, I'm thinking about some of Pantheon's tools, like there are so many great tools that Pantheon has that aren't accessible through Terminus that are still part of the WebOps stack.
Mhm.
Yeah. Speaking of Pantheon, love this segue.
Mm.
How does Pantheon support WebOps and in particular accessibility with WebOps?
Well, with WebOps, we are supporting not just like the DevOps and developer part, but also the performance of your site, which goes from like how fast is this going to how is my content even being serviced. We do have an accessibility statement on our website, so pantheon.io/accessibility-statement, and it talks about our commitment to ensuring that our ongoing accessibility work is adhering to level AA criteria of the WCAG 2.1 standards. Some of the ways that that is showing up in our work now is, thinking about this, not just from the developer hat. I'm happy to remind myself to take my developer hat off, right? But
Yep.
a good section of the people who access our Phoebe dashboard are people who are not developers, who are not going to put code in, who are just coming in to click through and get to the multi-dev to see, what does this look like? What has this been solved? Multi-dev environments have, even when I was doing some freelance work, working on Pantheon, being able to say, hey, you had this issue with when this goes responsive or this not having the color contrast issue. Here's the multi-dev that you can go to see where I've solved this issue. But then another issue is solved somewhere else, because we know that
Yep.
fixes on one item can affect another. But yeah.
It's interesting too, because that's a common thing too. Like developers, especially in the last 5 years or so, have made a real push, I think, especially in the Drupal community, to make the front end accessible. And Drupal in particular, the admin interface is fairly accessible as well. But many times we don't care about our tools. Our tool, we might make the most accessible website, but the tooling around the website isn't. And it's good to hear that Pantheon kind of has a statement about that and is making a push to make their tool accessible as well.
Yep. Before Pantheon, I've worked on numerous projects where I'm like, yes, I made it accessible on the developer end, and when it spits out the thing, it's great. And then the secretary that I was designing the tool for, with no like visible disabilities, right, comes in and says, ooh, I don't know how this works. I don't know how to put this content the way that it should be so that it can be accessible so we don't get sued. So even that part of the user experience is important.
Hey, Blake, we've talked about Equalify app a few times here, but actually haven't talked about it. Like, what is Equalify app?
Yeah, this should have been at the beginning of the show, probably.
Love
it. I figured we'd save it for like the end, like the big
Strong
reveal,
finish.
right?
Yeah. Well, Equalify is a project and a community to build a open source accessibility platform. And, we've been talking about all these different accessibility tools, Siteimprove, Wave, all these different things. And we're trying to bring it together into a single platform approach where a user can log in to Equalify or, log in via their local machine version of Equalify and instantly integrate and activate all the accessibility tools that they know and love. So the different accessibility scanners is what we've integrated so far, but also add in Drupal modules and extensions so that they can start working with Drupal. Right now we work with Drupal sitemaps. So that's the first kind of key into Drupal, but we can do things like add governance standards to Equalify in the future. Or do remediation directly from Equalify. So we're an open source project, again, trying to create a platform that is easily extendable to any accessibility service, and that becomes that kind of one key area that anyone who's doing any kind of accessibility remediation or testing is going to use. And we're slowly building in different integrations. We're actually very quickly building in integrations to different testing services and also different web services like Drupal, WordPress, Backdrop we were talking about the other day.
I feel like we should have you back on the show maybe in a couple of months to talk just about Equalify, because I mean, just a little bit of peaks here and there that I've heard you talking about it. I think it definitely deserves its own show. So I'll talk to John about that.
Woohoo.
I met Blake at Bad Camp, and so we were sitting at the Pantheon booth, and I'm like, I love accessibility, and here's why. And he's like, I made this thing for accessibility. I'm like, I was always wondering why this does not exist, and we're just like sitting there losing it about accessibility. So I'm so excited that you were able to come on and hopefully come back on again.
Thanks for inviting me. I love talking accessibility. I love hanging with all y'all. So this is great.
Yeah, it's been another great show. Well, Taryn, thank you for joining us for the last 4 weeks. It's been great having you on as a guest host, and as I'll extend the same invitation to you. If you have other topics, let us know, because we always love to hear from you.
If you have any questions or feedback, you can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or you could email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with the hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
And you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
You can also get a Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming camps, local meetups, Chad's Book Corner, and much more information. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and hit the button on the side called Become a Patron. So, Taryn, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yes, on Drupal Slack and on Drupal.org, I am 9livesblackcat, and on Twitter, I am at TEARYNEG.
And Blake, if our listeners want to get in touch with you.
I'm on the Drupal Slack as well, and on Twitter at BBERTUCC.
And Stephen, how about you?
The only way you can get in touch with me is to come to New England Drupal Camp. That'll be November 18th and 19th in Providence, Rhode Island.
And listeners can get in touch with me at NixVan, NICXVAN, pretty much everywhere.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
See you guys next week.